In the summer of 1996, in the wooded grounds of an 18-acre estate in suburban Indianapolis, investigators made a discovery that would haunt them for decades. Scattered among the trees and hidden in shallow graves were over 10,000 human bone fragments. Most had been burned, some had been crushed. All belonged to young men who had simply vanished into the night, lured by promises of companionship by a man they thought they could trust. That man was Herbert Baumeister, and for over a decade he had turned his million-dollar family farm into a private graveyard. Herbert Richard Baumeister was born on April 7th, 1947, in Indianapolis, the oldest of 4 children. His father was Dr. Herbert Eugene Baumeister, a respected anesthesiologist. His mother, Elizabeth, came from a well-established family. On paper, young Herbert had everything going for him. But even as a child, something was wrong. By elementary school, Herbert was already exhibiting behavior that disturbed his teachers and classmates. He had a macabre fascination with death that went far beyond normal childhood curiosity. He would bring dead animals to school, placing a rotting crow on his teacher's desk just to watch the reaction. Rumors spread that he urinated on classroom furniture and seemed to take pleasure in making others uncomfortable. His peers quickly learned to avoid him. Herbert didn't just lack social skills, he seemed to actively repel connection. He would stare too long, smile at inappropriate moments, and say things that made people deeply uncomfortable. By his teenage years, his behavior had become impossible to ignore. His father took him to multiple psychiatrists who diagnosed Herbert with paranoid schizophrenia and multiple personality disorder. But this was the 1960s, when mental health treatment was primitive and stigmatized. Whatever help Herbert received, it wasn't enough. The darkness inside him continued to grow. Herbert enrolled at Indiana University in 1965, but dropped out after his freshman year. He drifted between jobs, never quite fitting in anywhere. At the Indianapolis Star, where his father had gotten him a position as a copy boy, he became known for his desperate attempts to gain approval from his superiors. He would hover around reporters' desks, offering unsolicited help and making everyone uncomfortable with his intensity. In 1971, Herbert married Juliana Sider, whom he had met while working at the Bureau of Motor Vehicles. Juliana was drawn to his quiet intelligence and his apparent stability. She saw him as someone who needed care, someone she could help heal. She had no idea what she was truly signing up for. 6 months after their wedding, Herbert's father had him committed to a psychiatric hospital for 2 months. Juliana never learned exactly what happened during that time. Herbert refused to talk about it, and his family stayed silent. When he was released, he seemed different, more withdrawn, more carefully controlled. But Juliana loved him, and she convinced herself that whatever darkness had briefly surfaced was now behind them. In 1988, Herbert founded the Save-A-Lot thrift store chain in Indianapolis. It became wildly successful, making him a wealthy man. He and Juliana bought Fox Hollow Farm, an 18-acre estate in Westfield, complete with an 11,000 square foot Tudor-style mansion. They had 3 children and appeared to be the perfect suburban family. But Herbert was living a double life. While his family thought he was working late or traveling for business, Herbert was frequenting gay bars in downtown Indianapolis. He would cruise the same 4-block radius night after night, looking for a very specific type of victim: young men, usually in their 20s or 30s, often struggling financially or socially isolated, men who wouldn't be missed quickly, if at all. Herbert had perfected his approach. He was charming, well-dressed, and generous. He would buy drinks, tell jokes, and present himself as Brian Smart, a successful businessman looking for companionship. He would invite men back to his estate, promising them a party at his mansion with a pool, expensive liquor, and other wealthy guests. What happened next would become clear only years later, when investigators began piecing together the testimonies of the few men who survived encounters with Herbert Baumeister. One of those survivors was Tony Harris, who met Herbert at the 501 Club, a popular gay bar in Indianapolis. Herbert, calling himself Brian, seemed like a catch: wealthy, sophisticated, and interested in showing Tony a good time. He invited Tony back to Fox Hollow Farm, describing his massive estate and indoor pool. When they arrived at the mansion, Tony was impressed. The house was everything Herbert had promised: opulent, sprawling, and isolated. Herbert led him down to the basement, where there was indeed a pool room. But once they were alone, Herbert's demeanor changed completely. He suggested they try erotic asphyxiation, producing a pool hose and explaining how it would enhance Tony's pleasure. When Tony agreed, Herbert looped the hose around his neck and began to tighten it. But he didn't stop when Tony began to struggle. He kept pulling, his eyes cold and focused, as Tony fought for his life. Tony managed to break free and flee the house, running barefoot through the woods until he reached safety. When he later told his story to investigators, they realized they were dealing with something far more sinister than simple assault. They were dealing with a predator who had perfected his method of killing. Between 1980 and 1996, at least 25 young men disappeared from the Indianapolis area. Most were last seen at gay bars within that same 4-block radius where Herbert hunted. Some had told friends they were going home with a wealthy older man. Others simply vanished without a trace. The police response was sluggish and inadequate. In the 1980s and early 1990s, law enforcement agencies were notoriously indifferent to crimes against gay men. Missing person reports were often filed away without serious investigation. The victims were frequently dismissed as runaways or written off as casualties of risky lifestyles. It wasn't until 1994 that the families of missing men took action themselves. They hired private investigator Virgil Vandegrift to find Alan Wayne Broussard and Roger Allen Goodlett, two men who had disappeared after nights out at local gay bars. Vandegrift began connecting the dots that police had ignored for years. The breakthrough came when Tony Harris contacted Vandegrift and told him about his encounter with Brian Smart. Harris had managed to get the license plate number of the car his attacker had been driving. When Vandegrift ran the plates, they came back registered to Herbert Richard Baumeister. Detective Mary Wilson of the Indianapolis Police Department took over the investigation. When she approached Herbert at his store, she found him nervous and evasive. He admitted to frequenting gay bars, but claimed his family knew nothing about it. When Wilson asked to search his property, Herbert refused and told her to go through his lawyer. Wilson then approached Juliana, hoping to get permission to search Fox Hollow Farm. She told Juliana about the missing men and her husband's connection to them. Juliana was shocked, but ultimately refused to allow the search. Her lawyer had advised her that it could affect Herbert's business. For months, Wilson tried to obtain a search warrant, but Hamilton County officials refused, saying there wasn't enough evidence. Meanwhile, Herbert continued his deadly routine. More men disappeared, and their families begged for answers that never came. Then, in late 1994, Herbert's own son made a discovery that would begin his father's undoing. The 15-year-old was playing in the woods behind their mansion when he found a human skull. He brought it to his mother, thinking it was interesting. When Juliana confronted Herbert about the skull, he had a ready explanation. It had belonged to his father, he said, a medical specimen from his days as an anesthesiologist. Herbert had found it while cleaning out his father's old belongings and had thoughtlessly tossed it in the woods. Juliana wanted to believe him, so she did. But by 1995, their marriage was crumbling. Herbert had become increasingly erratic and unpredictable. His business was failing, and he was spending more and more time away from home. Juliana finally decided she wanted a divorce. In June 1996, while Herbert was away on what he claimed was a business trip, Juliana made the decision that would expose his crimes. She contacted Detective Wilson and gave her permission to search the property. What investigators found at Fox Hollow Farm was a horror beyond imagination. Scattered throughout the woods were human bones and bone fragments, some buried in shallow graves, others simply left on the surface. Many showed signs of having been burned in fires. Some had been crushed, as if someone had tried to destroy the evidence. In total, investigators recovered over 10,000 pieces of human remains. They found handcuffs, shotgun shells, and other evidence of violence. They discovered that Herbert had built fires in the woods, using the flames to burn bodies and destroy evidence. The basement pool room, where Tony Harris had nearly died, showed signs of having been meticulously cleaned, but luminol tests revealed traces of blood. As the investigation unfolded, Herbert was in Canada, where he had fled as soon as he learned that police were searching his property. On July 3rd, 1996, 10 days after the first bones were discovered, Herbert drove to Pinery Provincial Park in Ontario. He sat in his car, wrote a 3-page suicide note, and shot himself in the head with a .357 Magnum. In his final letter, Herbert expressed regret for messing up the park and apologized for his failing marriage and crumbling business. But he never mentioned the bones, never confessed to the murders, never acknowledged the families whose lives he had destroyed. Even in death, he showed no remorse for his victims. With Herbert's suicide, the criminal investigation essentially ended, but the forensic work was just beginning. Over the next several years, investigators painstakingly analyzed the bone fragments, trying to identify as many victims as possible. By 1999, they had identified 8 men: Johnny Bayer, Alan Wayne Broussard, Roger Allen Goodlett, Richard Hamilton, Stephen Hale, Jeff Allen Jones, Michael Kieran, and Manuel Resendez. All were young men who had disappeared between 1993 and 1995, most after visiting gay bars in Indianapolis. All had been reported missing by family or friends who never stopped looking for them. But identifying 8 victims left thousands of bone fragments unaccounted for. Investigators believed there were at least 17 more victims buried at Fox Hollow Farm, possibly more. Some of the remains were so badly burned and fragmented that they might never be identified. In recent years, advances in DNA technology have renewed hope for identifying more of Herbert's victims. In 2022, Hamilton County Coroner Jeff Jellison launched a new effort using forensic genetic genealogy. In 2023, they identified Alan Livingston, a 27-year-old who had vanished in August 1993. In 2024, they identified Jeffrey Jones, another victim from that same deadly summer. But questions remain about the full scope of Herbert's crimes. Some investigators believe he may have been responsible for additional murders dating back to the early 1980s. He has been linked to the I-70 Strangler case, a series of murders along Interstate 70 in Indiana and Ohio, where young men were found dead near the highway, often dumped in ditches or remote areas. The timeline fits, the victim profile matches, and Herbert's method of operation, luring young men from gay bars, then killing and disposing of their bodies, aligns with the I-70 murders. If these connections are proven, Herbert's victim count could exceed 40 people, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. What makes Herbert Baumeister particularly chilling is not just the number of his victims, but the calculated nature of his crimes. This wasn't a killer driven by uncontrollable rage or obvious mental illness. Herbert was methodical, organized, and patient. He maintained his double life for over a decade, appearing to be a successful businessman and family man while systematically hunting and killing young men. He chose his victims carefully, targeting those who were vulnerable or unlikely to be missed quickly. He perfected his hunting ground, operating within the same small area where he knew he could find victims. He developed sophisticated methods for disposing of bodies, using fire and crushing to destroy evidence. Most disturbing of all, he did this while living with his wife and children, who had no idea that their husband and father was a monster. Herbert's case also highlights the systemic failures that allowed him to kill for so long. Police indifference to crimes against gay men meant that his early victims were never seriously investigated. The lack of coordination between law enforcement agencies meant that patterns went unnoticed, and the stigma surrounding homosexuality in the 1980s and 1990s meant that many victims were reluctant to come forward, even when they survived attacks. Today, Fox Hollow Farm stands as a monument to Herbert's crimes and the failures that enabled them. The property has changed hands several times since 1996. The current owners report strange occurrences, unexplained sounds, cold spots, and the feeling of being watched. Some attribute these phenomena to the spirits of Herbert's victims, still trapped on the land where they died. But the real haunting of Fox Hollow Farm isn't supernatural. It's the knowledge that somewhere beneath the soil there may still be more victims waiting to be found. It's the faces of young men who smiled in photos, then vanished into the darkness Herbert created. It's the families who still wait for answers, still hope for closure, still wonder what happened to their sons and brothers and lovers who simply never came home. Herbert Baumeister died without ever explaining why he killed. He never revealed the full extent of his crimes. He never showed remorse for the lives he destroyed. In the end, He was as he had always been, selfish, cruel, and utterly indifferent to the suffering of others. The investigation continues today, nearly 30 years after Herbert's death. Coroner Jellison and his team are still working to identify victims, still appealing to families to provide DNA samples, still searching for answers. They estimate it could take several more years to identify all the remains found at Fox Hollow Farm. For the families of Herbert's victims, the wait continues. But with each identification, each name restored to what was once just scattered bones, they move one step closer to the closure that Herbert tried to deny them. In death, his victims are finally being remembered as the people they were, loved sons and brothers and friends whose lives mattered, whose deaths demand justice, and whose memories deserve to be honored. Herbert Baumeister thought he could kill with impunity, that his victims would simply disappear without a trace. But even in death, even decades later, the truth has a way of surfacing. The bones don't lie, the evidence doesn't fade, and the families never stop searching for answers. In the end, Herbert's legacy isn't the fear he spread or the lives he took. It's the determination of those left behind to ensure that his victims are never forgotten, that their stories are told, and that justice, however delayed, finally comes to Fox Hollow Farm. Looking at the night that would shatter countless lives, let's begin with a slow drive through East Meadow, Long Island. It's 1993. The air is thick with summer heat, and somewhere in that darkness, a 34-year-old man with thick glasses and a nervous stutter is about to make a mistake that would finally reveal what he'd been hiding for years. The man's name is Joel Rifkin, and in the back of his pickup truck is the decomposing body of a woman named Tiffany Bresciani. But this isn't where the story starts. This is where it ends. To understand how Joel Rifkin became one of New York's most prolific serial killers, we have to go back much further. We have to understand the boy before the monster. Joel David Rifkin was born on January 20th, 1959, to two unwed college students who gave him up for adoption. 3 weeks later, Bernard and Jana Rifkin took him home to their middle-class house on Long Island. To anyone looking from the outside, it seemed like a perfect beginning. The Rifkins were educated, financially stable, and within 3 years, they adopted a daughter named John to complete their family. But perfection is often an illusion, and for Joel, childhood became a relentless series of small cruelties that would slowly poison his developing mind. From the moment he walked into kindergarten at Prospect Avenue Elementary School, Joel was marked as different. He had thick glasses that magnified his eyes, a slow, shuffling gait that earned him the nickname Turtle, and an unfortunate slouching posture that made him appear smaller than he already was. Worse still, he suffered from undiagnosed dyslexia, which meant that despite having an IQ of 100 to 28, he struggled academically in ways that frustrated both his teachers and his father. Bernard Rifkin was a structural engineer, a man of precision and logic who had excelled in mathematics and athletics during his own youth. Watching his adopted son fail at basic coordination, stumble through reading assignments, and struggle with sports filled him with a disappointment he couldn't hide. The more Joel failed to meet his father's expectations, the deeper the chasm between them grew. At school, the bullying was relentless. Joel's classmates called him an abuse unit, a term that captured how easily he could be tormented without fighting back. They would trip him in hallways, steal his belongings, and exclude him from every social activity that might have given him a sense of belonging. Even when he tried to join the track team, his teammates turned him into their personal target, making practices a daily humiliation rather than an escape. One particularly cruel incident occurred when Joel joined the yearbook committee, hoping that his interest in photography might finally connect him with like-minded peers. Instead, his camera was immediately stolen, and when the committee held their end-of-year party, Joel was the only member not invited. His mother later said it was the only time she ever saw him visibly shaken to his core. But perhaps the most damaging aspect of Joel's childhood wasn't any single act of cruelty. It was the gradual realization that he was invisible unless someone wanted to hurt him. Teachers overlooked him, classmates ignored him, and even his own father seemed to view him as a disappointment. The only person who showed him consistent warmth was his mother, who shared his interests in photography and gardening. But even her love couldn't shield him from the world outside their home. By his teenage years, something fundamental had shifted inside Joel's mind. The boy who had once desperately wanted to fit in began retreating into dark fantasies. In 1972, at age 13, he watched Alfred Hitchcock's film Frenzy, a psychological thriller partly inspired by Jack the Ripper. The movie featured graphic scenes of sexual violence and murder, and rather than being disturbed, Joel found himself captivated. He began fantasizing about strangling women, imagining scenarios where he held complete control over life and death. When Joel turned 17, his parents bought him his first car, hoping it might give him some independence and confidence. Instead, it became a tool for exploration of a different kind. Joel began driving to Hempstead and later Manhattan, cruising areas known for prostitution. He told himself he was just looking, just fantasizing, but the seeds of something darker were already taking root. Joel graduated from East Meadow High School in 1977, but college proved to be another series of failures. He bounced between Nassau Community College, SUNY Brockport, and SUNY Farmingdale, but his obsession with visiting sex workers consumed more and more of his time and money. He would skip classes and miss work to spend hours driving through red light districts, the only place where he felt he could interact with women without the fear of rejection. By 1984, Joel had dropped out of college entirely. He moved back in with his parents and started a landscaping business, work that kept him isolated and allowed him to maintain the double life he was developing. To his family, he was the quiet, disappointing son who couldn't quite get his life together. To the women he encountered on the streets, he was just another lonely customer. Then, in February 1987, Bernard Rifkin committed suicide. He had been battling prostate cancer, and the pain had become unbearable. Joel delivered the eulogy at his father's funeral, speaking about love and forgiveness. But those who knew him said that after that day, something seemed to break inside him completely. Less than 2 months later, Joel was arrested during a police sting operation in Hempstead, caught trying to solicit an undercover officer. It was a humiliation that confirmed what he'd always suspected about himself. He was worthless, pathetic, someone who couldn't even successfully buy what he desperately needed. And then came February 20th. 1989, exactly 2 years after his father's death. Joel waited until his mother left on a business trip. Then he drove to the city and picked up a young woman named Heidi Balch, though he would later refer to her only as Susie in his confessions. He told her he would pay her for sex and brought her back to his childhood home in East Meadow. What happened next was the culmination of years of rage, humiliation, and violent fantasy finally made real. In the basement of the house where he'd grown up, Joel bludgeoned Heidi with a howitzer artillery shell that he kept as a decoration. When she continued to struggle, he strangled her to death with his bare hands. And then something extraordinary happened. For the first time in his life, Joel Rifkin felt completely calm. He spent the next several hours methodically dismembering her body with an X-Acto knife. He removed her teeth with pliers and cut off her fingertips to prevent identification. He put her severed head in an old paint can, which he later dumped in the woods of a New Jersey golf course. Her arms and torso went into the East River, while her legs were disposed of in a creek in Jefferson Township. When he was finished, Joel went to sleep. He slept better that night than he had in years. For the next 4 years, Joel Rifkin lived 2 completely different lives. During the day, he was the quiet landscaper who lived with his mother and sister, a man so unremarkable that neighbors barely noticed him. But at night, he became something else entirely, a predator who haunted the streets of New York City, hunting women who lived on society's margins. His victims were sex workers, drug addicts, women whose disappearances often went unreported and unmourned. Joel chose them carefully, not out of hatred for women specifically, but because they were invisible in the same way he had always been invisible. The difference was that now he held the power to make them disappear forever. He would pick them up with promises of money, drive them to isolated locations, and then strangle them with his bare hands or various ligatures. Sometimes he would beat them first, sometimes he would sexually assault them, but the killing was always the climax, the moment when all the rage and humiliation of his childhood finally found its release. Between 1989 and 1993, Joel Rifkin murdered 17 women. Each killing followed a similar pattern. He would dispose of the bodies in remote locations throughout New York and New Jersey, often dismembering them to prevent identification. He kept souvenirs from some of his victims, jewelry and personal items that he would later categorize with the same meticulous attention to detail that he brought to his landscaping work. The police had no idea that a single killer was responsible for the mounting number of missing women. Joel was careful, methodical, and completely unremarkable. He drove an old Mazda pickup truck, dressed in ordinary clothes, and spoke with the nervous stutter that made him seem harmless. He was the perfect invisible predator, and he might have continued killing indefinitely if not for a 25-cent mistake. On June 28, 1993, at 3:15 in the morning, Joel was driving down the Southern State Parkway with Tiffany Bresciani's decomposing body in the back of his truck. He was heading to dispose of her in his usual methodical way when 2 state troopers noticed that his vehicle was missing a license plate. When they signaled for him to pull over, Joel panicked. Instead of stopping, he led them on a 20-minute chase that ended when he lost control and crashed into a utility pole in Mineola. As the officers approached his truck, they were overwhelmed by a smell so powerful it made them gag. In the back of the truck, wrapped in a blue tarpaulin, they found what remained of Tiffany Bresciani. At the police station, when detectives asked Joel if he had killed anyone else, he began to talk. And once he started, he couldn't stop. Over the next several hours, he confessed to murder after murder, providing details that only the killer could know. He drew maps showing where he had dumped bodies, described the jewelry he had taken as souvenirs, and spoke about each killing with a detached calm that horrified even experienced homicide detectives. Joel Rifkin was ultimately convicted of 9 murders and sentenced to 203 years in prison. He won't be eligible for parole until 2197, when he would be 238 years old. But the true number of his victims remains unknown. He claimed to have killed 17 women, and investigators believe the number might be even higher. Today, Joel Rifkin sits in his cell at the Clinton Correctional Facility in upstate New York, participating in interviews and documentaries about his crimes. He speaks about murder the way other people might discuss a hobby, with technical precision and apparent emotional detachment. He has said that killing became an addiction for him, that he thought of his victims as objects rather than people, and that he knew he would never have stopped on his own. In one chilling interview, he admitted that prison was probably the best place for him, that without the constraints of confinement, he would likely still be killing today. What makes Joel Rifkin's story particularly disturbing isn't just the number of lives he took, but how ordinary he seemed. He wasn't a charismatic psychopath like Ted Bundy or a flamboyant sadist like John Wayne Gacy. He was quiet, unremarkable, forgettable, the kind of person who could commit unspeakable acts and then disappear back into suburban anonymity. His case became so notorious that it even inspired a plotline on Seinfeld, where Elaine's boyfriend happened to share the killer's name and was tormented by the association. But for the families of his victims, there was nothing comedic about the man who had stolen their daughters, sisters, and mothers. Most of Joel's victims were never even reported missing. They were women living on the edges of society, struggling with addiction and poverty, whose deaths went unnoticed by everyone except the man who killed them. Even now, 2 of his victims remain unidentified, known only as Jane Does in police files. Joel Rifkin represents a particular kind of evil, the banality of a broken person who transforms pain into power, who takes a lifetime of being invisible and uses it to make others disappear forever. He was the bullied child who never learned empathy, the rejected teenager who confused sex with violence, the disappointed son who turned his father's suicide into justification for his own monstrous acts. He reminds us that some of the most dangerous people in our society aren't the obvious predators we fear in dark alleys. Sometimes they're the quiet neighbors, the unremarkable men who fix our lawns and blend into the background, carrying inside them a darkness so profound that when it finally emerges, it leaves nothing but devastation in its wake. Joel Rifkin didn't become a killer overnight. He was shaped by years of cruelty, rejection, and the gradual erosion of whatever humanity he might have possessed. His story is a reminder that evil rarely announces itself with fanfare. Sometimes it just shuffles quietly through our world, invisible until it's far too late. Looking at a warm afternoon in downtown Los Angeles, somewhere along the familiar stretch of Figueroa Street, where buses groaned through traffic and vendors sold fruit from makeshift carts, a man was walking. He was unremarkable in every way that mattered to strangers, just another face in the sprawling urban landscape of South Central. But if you had known what to look for, if you had peered deeper into those hollow eyes that never seemed to focus on anything for too long, you might have seen something else entirely. This was Chester Dwayne Turner, and for over a decade he had been hunting women in plain sight. But this story doesn't begin with the hunting. It begins with a 5-year-old boy, scared and displaced, following his mother from Warren, Arkansas, to the concrete maze of Los Angeles in 1971. Chester was just another child caught in the machinery of family dissolution, his father left behind in Arkansas, his future uncertain in a city that swallowed dreams as easily as it created them. The move should have been a fresh start. Instead, it became the foundation of something much darker. Chester's mother tried to build a life for them in the sprawling neighborhoods of South LA, but the boy struggled from the beginning. In elementary school, his teachers noticed he was different. Not learning disabled, not obviously troubled, just distant. He would sit in the back of classrooms, watching other children with an intensity that made them uncomfortable. By middle school at Gompers, the other kids had a nickname for him, Chester the Molester. They whispered it in hallways, a cruel label for a boy who had developed an unsettling habit of grabbing at girls when he thought no one was looking. It should have been a warning sign, a cry for help, some kind of intervention. Instead, it was just another piece of schoolyard cruelty that everyone chose to ignore. Chester dropped out of Locke High School before graduating. The teenage years that should have been spent figuring out his place in the world were instead spent drifting between odd jobs and longer stretches of unemployment. He worked briefly at Domino's Pizza, delivering food to the same neighborhoods where he would later stalk his victims. Even then, co-workers remembered something unsettling about him. He was quiet, polite enough, but there was something in the way he looked at women that made them step back without quite understanding why. His mother moved to Utah when Chester was in his early 20s, leaving him truly alone for the first time. What followed was a descent into homelessness and petty crime that would define the next phase of his life. He bounced between shelters and missions, the midnight mission downtown becoming a regular stop. To the social workers and volunteers who tried to help him, Chester appeared to be just another casualty of urban poverty. They saw a man struggling with basic survival, not a predator learning to perfect his hunting techniques. Between 1995 and 2002, Chester was arrested 7 times. 6 of those arrests were for nonviolent offenses, the kind of petty crimes that filled up the court dockets in a city overwhelmed by poverty and addiction. Theft, drug possession, the bureaucratic dance of a man circling the edges of society without anyone paying close attention to the pattern that was forming. But Chester wasn't just surviving on the margins. He was learning. Every arrest, every night in lockup, every interaction with law enforcement was teaching him how the system worked, how to avoid detection, how to choose victims who wouldn't be missed. Because by 1987, Chester Turner had already begun killing. Her name was Diane Johnson, and she was 21 years old when two motorists found her body on March 9th, 1987, in a roadway construction area west of the Harbor Freeway. She had been raped, strangled, and stripped of her clothes before being dumped like garbage in a place where Chester knew she might not be discovered for days. It was a crime so efficient, so coldly calculated, that it suggested this wasn't his first time taking a life. The killing of Diane Johnson established a pattern that would define Chester's method for the next 11 years. He targeted vulnerable women, many of them struggling with addiction or involved in sex work to survive. These were women who lived on society's margins, whose disappearances often went unnoticed for weeks or months. When their bodies were finally discovered, the investigations were hampered by a fundamental lack of resources, and, if we're being honest, a lack of public pressure to solve crimes against women the city had already written off. 3 months after Diane Johnson's murder, Chester killed again. Elandra Joyce Bunn was 33 years old when her nude body was found in a pile of trash in June 1987. The horror of her discovery was compounded by the fact that an 11-year-old boy named Alvin McThomas found her remains. The autopsy revealed the systematic brutality that would become Chester's signature: battered and bloody eyes, abrasions and lacerations on her head and neck, bruises covering her neck and torso. She had been strangled to death, but not before being subjected to a prolonged assault that spoke to Chester's need to inflict suffering before ending his victims' lives. By October 1987, Chester had claimed his third confirmed victim. Annette Ernest, 26 years old and originally from Louisiana, was found lying on the shoulder of a road, partially nude and strangled. The location was significant because it fell within what investigators would later identify as Chester's hunting ground, a narrow corridor along Figueroa Street between Gage Avenue and 108th Street, a stretch of road that ran through some of the most impoverished and overlooked neighborhoods in Los Angeles. What made Chester Turner so dangerous wasn't just his willingness to kill, it was his ability to remain invisible while doing it. He lived within 30 blocks of every murder, often staying at shelters or missions that put him in direct contact with the kind of vulnerable women he targeted. To the people who ran these facilities, Chester was just another homeless man trying to get by. He was polite, kept to himself, and never caused the kind of obvious trouble that would have gotten him banned. He was hiding in plain sight, and the system designed to help people like him was inadvertently providing him with access to his victims. In January 1989, Chester murdered 31-year-old Anita Fishman, leaving her body partially nude outside a garage in an alley off Figueroa Street. 8 months later, he killed Regina Washington, who was 27 years old and visibly pregnant when Chester strangled her to death. Her body was discovered in the detached garage of a vacant home, and the brutality of her murder represented a new level of depravity. Chester hadn't just killed a woman, he had killed an unborn child, demonstrating a complete absence of empathy or human connection. The years between 1989 and 1998 became a nightmare of systematic violence. Chester developed routines, patterns of behavior that allowed him to identify potential victims, isolate them, and kill them with a coldness that suggested he had moved beyond any normal psychological boundaries. He would approach women on foot, often near Figueroa Street, engaging them in brief conversations before luring them to more isolated locations. Sometimes he offered money, sometimes shelter, sometimes just the promise of companionship. Once he had his victims alone, Chester would rape them with methodical brutality before strangling them to death. He never used weapons, relying instead on his physical strength and the psychological terror he could inflict. The strangulation was always prolonged, suggesting that he derived pleasure from watching his victims die. When he was finished, he would dump their bodies in alleys, behind buildings, or in vacant lots, often leaving them partially clothed in ways that seemed designed to maximize the humiliation even in death. Between 1993 and 1995, Chester's pace accelerated. He murdered Andrea Triplett, 29 years old and 5.5 months pregnant, leaving her body behind a derelict building on Figueroa Street. He killed Desiree Jones, 29, dumping her body in a backyard where it would be discovered weeks later. Natalie Price, 31, was found dead and partially clothed near an empty house, another victim of Chester's systematic campaign of violence. By 1996, Chester had been killing for nearly a decade, and still no one connected him to the growing number of bodies being discovered throughout South Central Los Angeles. The police were overwhelmed by violent crime rates that topped 1,000 murders per year, and the deaths of poor women of color simply didn't generate the kind of public pressure that might have led to a coordinated investigation. This was exactly the environment Chester needed to continue operating. In November 1996, he murdered Mildred Williams Beasley, a 45-year-old woman originally from Michigan who was married and had a teenage son. Her body was found partially nude and strangled among bushes alongside the 110 freeway, a location that suggested Chester was growing more confident about where he disposed of his victims. The following year, he killed Cynthia Annette Johnson, 30 years old, strangling her to death in the Green Meadows neighborhood of South Los Angeles. But it was Chester's final 2 murders that would ultimately lead to his capture, though it would take years for investigators to make the connection. On February 3rd, 1998, Chester murdered Paula Vance, a 38-year-old woman who suffered from mental illness and was transient. What made this killing different was its location. The Olympia tool business in Azusa, where Vance's murder was partially captured by 5 nearby security cameras. The footage showed Chester as little more than a dark shadow, but investigators were able to see the systematic nature of his attack. One camera would have filmed Chester's face clearly, but it cut away just moments before he came into frame. 2 months later, Chester committed what investigators believe was his final murder in Los Angeles. Brenda Breeze, 39 years old, was found strangled in a portable toilet near Little Tokyo on April 6, 1998. The location was significant because it was just 50 yards from the hotel where Chester was staying at the time, a proximity that would later help investigators understand how he selected his hunting grounds. After Brenda Breeze's murder, Chester disappeared from Los Angeles. He had violated his parole on previous convictions for auto theft and drug sales, and rather than face the consequences, he fled to Utah where his mother was living. For several years, It seemed as though the killing had stopped, though investigators had no idea why. The truth was that Chester Turner had simply moved his hunting grounds. In September 1998, the body of Atisha Camp was found behind a business in Salt Lake City, Utah. She had been strangled to death, displaying the same methodical brutality that had characterized Chester's murders in Los Angeles, but without any obvious connection to the California cases. Camp's murder remained unsolved for decades. Meanwhile, back in Los Angeles, Chester eventually returned to the city where he had perfected his techniques. By 2002, he was working as a security guard at the Midnight Mission, the same downtown homeless shelter where he had sometimes stayed during his years of transience. The irony was lost on no one later. The system designed to help vulnerable people had employed their predator as a protector. It was in March 2002 that Chester made the mistake that would finally expose him. He approached a 47-year-old woman named Maria Martinez near the mission, asking to borrow a cigarette lighter. When she handed it to him, Chester grabbed her neck and dragged her behind a dumpster, where he raped her for approximately 2 hours while threatening to kill her if she told police. But Maria Martinez did something that Chester's murder victims had never been able to do. She survived. Initially, Martinez's report to police was dismissed. She was a transient woman reporting a rape in an area where such crimes were unfortunately common, and her account was met with skepticism. But Martinez was persistent. She returned to the Midnight Mission the next day and told a staff member what had happened. That staff member, unlike the police, believed her and convinced her to try reporting the crime again. This time, Martinez was taken seriously. A rape kit was performed, DNA evidence was collected, and Chester was arrested. In a pattern that had defined his entire criminal career, Chester initially denied involvement, but eventually pleaded no contest to the rape charges. He was sentenced to 8 years in prison and transferred to the Sierra Conservation Center in Tuolumne County. As part of his sentence, Chester was required to provide a DNA sample to California's Combined DNA Index System. It was a routine procedure, the kind of bureaucratic requirement that had probably saved countless lives by identifying repeat offenders. Chester provided the sample and began serving his time, apparently confident that his years of killing had left no trace that could be connected to him. He was wrong. In September 2003, Chester's DNA sample was processed and entered into the system. Within hours, it had matched DNA evidence recovered from the murders of Paula Vance and Brenda Breeze. Suddenly, investigators had a suspect for murders that had gone unsolved for 5 years. But the DNA matches were just the beginning. Once detectives began examining Chester's background, they realized they had potentially solved one of the largest serial killing cases in Los Angeles history. By October 2004, 10 additional unsolved murders of women had been matched to Chester using DNA evidence. The investigation revealed the full scope of Chester's hunting ground and methodology. Every murder had occurred within walking distance of places where Chester had lived or worked. The victims were all vulnerable women who lived on society's margins, exactly the kind of people Chester had encountered during his years of homelessness and employment at homeless services. Most disturbing of all, the investigation revealed that another man had already been convicted for some of Chester's crimes. David Allen Jones had spent 11 years in prison for the murders of 3 women that DNA evidence now linked to Chester Turner. Jones was exonerated and released in March 2004, but the case highlighted how easily the system had accepted the conviction of a black man for crimes he didn't commit while the real killer continued operating in the same neighborhoods. Chester Turner was charged with 10 counts of first-degree murder in 2005. His trial began 2 years later, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. DNA evidence linked him definitively to multiple crime scenes. Security camera footage showed him committing one of the murders. His proximity to every crime scene established both opportunity and a pattern of behavior. On April 30th, 2007, Chester was convicted on all 10 murder charges, plus the death of Regina Washington's unborn child. The courtroom was filled with family members of his victims, many of whom had waited decades for justice. When the verdict was read, some wept with relief, while others sat in stunned silence, finally hearing someone take responsibility for losses that had devastated their lives. 2 weeks later, on July 10th, 2007, Chester Turner was sentenced to death. Superior Court Judge William R. Pounders called him one of the most prolific serial killers in the city's history, a designation that captured both the scope of his crimes and their impact on the community. But Chester's killing hadn't ended with his arrest. In 2014, he was convicted of 4 additional murders: Deborah Williams, 28, Cynthia Annette Johnson, 30, Elandra Joyce Bunn, 33, and Mary Edwards, 42. Once again, DNA evidence had linked him to crimes that had gone unsolved for over a decade. He was sentenced to death for a second time on June 26, 2014. The full scope of Chester Turner's crimes may never be known. Investigators believe he was responsible for at least 14 confirmed murders in Los Angeles, plus the killing of Atisha Camp in Utah. But given his years of mobility and the number of unsolved cases involving similar victims and methods, the actual number could be much higher. In 2024, Chester was charged with Camp's murder in Utah, finally connecting him to that 1998 killing through DNA evidence. At 57 years old, he continues to sit on death row at San Quentin State Prison, where he has been joined by some of California's most notorious killers. Today, Chester Turner remains largely unknown outside of law enforcement and true crime communities. He never gained the notoriety of killers like Ted Bundy or John Wayne Gacy, partly because his victims were women society had already marginalized, and partly because his methods were efficient rather than theatrical. He didn't seek fame or recognition, he simply wanted to kill. But the families of his victims remember. Jerry Johnson, whose daughter Andrea Triplett was murdered while pregnant, spoke about the lasting impact of Chester's crimes during his trial. "My daughter was 29 years old and 5.5 months pregnant when she was killed," she said. "She had a 7-year-old daughter, a 10-year-old son. She was a very loving mother." The fact that many of Chester's victims were struggling with addiction or involved in sex work doesn't diminish their humanity or the loss felt by those who loved them. These were daughters, mothers, sisters, women who found themselves vulnerable in a city that offered little protection for people living on its margins. Chester Turner's story is ultimately about more than one man's descent into serial murder. It's about systemic failures that allowed a predator to operate undetected for over a decade. It's about the way society's most vulnerable people can become invisible, their disappearances met with indifference rather than urgency. It's also about the persistence of people like Maria Martinez, whose survival and courage to report her assault finally brought Chester's killing spree to an end. Without her willingness to come forward, despite initial police skepticism, Chester might have continued killing indefinitely. In the end, Chester Turner proves that some of the most dangerous killers aren't the ones who capture headlines with elaborate crimes or bizarre motivations. Sometimes evil is simply methodical, patient, and utterly without conscience. Chester spent over a decade perfecting his ability to identify, isolate, and kill vulnerable women while moving through society as just another face in the crowd. He was the man walking past you on Figueroa Street, unremarkable and forgettable, carrying within him a darkness that defied understanding. His victims deserved better from the systems meant to protect them, and their stories deserve to be remembered, not just as statistics in a serial killer's tally, but as lives that mattered and deaths that should never have happened. On a frigid December morning in 1979, firefighters rushed into the smoke-filled room 417 of the Travel Inn Motor Hotel near Times Square. The air reeked of burning flesh and something else, something chemical and wrong. Through the haze, they spotted what appeared to be two unconscious women on the twin beds. One firefighter grabbed the first body, preparing to carry her to safety, when he suddenly stopped cold. "I was preparing to give mouth-to-mouth resuscitation," he would later say, his voice still trembling years after, "when I suddenly noticed there was no head." As the smoke cleared, the true horror revealed itself. Two naked torsos lay on the beds, their heads and hands severed with surgical precision. The killer had set them ablaze before fleeing into the chaos of New York City. But this wasn't the work of some deranged madman operating in shadows. This was the calculated brutality of Richard Francis Cottingham, a married father of 3 who lived in suburban New Jersey and worked as a computer programmer for Blue Cross Blue Shield. By day, he was an ordinary man fixing computers and coming home to dinner. By night, he was hunting women in the neon-lit darkness of Times Square, earning him the moniker that would define his legacy, the Torso Killer. Richard Cottingham was born on November 25, 1946, in the Mott Haven neighborhood of the Bronx. Unlike the broken homes and traumatic childhoods that shaped so many serial killers, Richard came from what appeared to be a stable, middle-class Catholic family. His father worked as a vice president at Metropolitan Life Insurance. His mother was a homemaker. There were no obvious warning signs, no red flags that suggested the darkness growing inside. When Richard was 12, the family moved to Rivervale, New Jersey, where he attended Catholic school. He was a quiet, introverted boy who struggled to make friends, partly due to poor eyesight that kept him from excelling at sports. Teachers remembered him as polite and unremarkable, the kind of student who could sit in the back of a classroom and disappear entirely. But even then, there were subtle signs for those who knew how to look. Richard preferred to be alone. He joined the track team not for the camaraderie, but because running gave him solitude. He spent hours in his mother's garden, tinkering with projects, lost in his own thoughts. What no one realized was that those thoughts were beginning to turn dark. After graduating high school, Richard followed his father's path into the insurance industry. He started in the mailroom at Metropolitan Life and worked his way up to computer operator, a job that suited his preference for working alone with machines rather than people. In 1966, he took a position at Blue Cross Blue Shield, where he would remain employed until his arrest 14 years later. On the surface, Richard's life seemed to be falling into place. In 1970, at age 23, he married Janet in a ceremony at Our Lady of Lourdes Church in Queens Village. They would have 3 children together, 2 boys and a girl. Richard bought a house in Lodi, New Jersey, and settled into suburban life. But behind the facade of normalcy, something sinister was taking root. The first murder came in 1967 when Richard was just 21 years old. Nancy Shiava Vogel, a 29-year-old mother of 2, was found strangled in her car in Ridgefield Park, New Jersey. Her body was discovered 3 days after she'd left for a church bingo game. The killing was brutal, but not random, though no one suspected the quiet computer programmer who'd somehow crossed paths with Nancy that October night. For years, the murder remained unsolved. Richard continued his life, working his day job, coming home to his wife and children, maintaining the perfect image of suburban respectability. But the killing had awakened something in him, a hunger that wouldn't stay satisfied. By the early 1970s, Richard had developed what he would later describe as an obsession with bondage and control. He rented an apartment in New York City, claiming he needed it for late work nights. But the apartment served a different purpose. Janet would later discover it was filled with women's clothing, shoes, and jewelry, trophies from victims whose names she would never know. Richard had also begun frequenting the seedy clubs and bars of Manhattan's red light district. Times Square in the 1970s was a different world, a neon-lit playground of strip clubs, peep shows, and prostitution. It was the perfect hunting ground for a predator who'd learned to blend in, to appear harmless and respectable even as he stalked his prey. His method was disturbingly systematic. Richard would approach women, often sex workers, in bars or on the street. He was well-dressed, articulate, and carried himself with the confidence of a successful businessman. He didn't look dangerous. He would offer them drinks, slipping a drug called Tuinal into their alcohol. Tuinal was a powerful sedative that would leave victims disoriented and compliant. Once the drugs took effect, Richard would lead his victims to motels, usually paying in cash and using fake names. What happened next defied human comprehension. He would bind his victims with rope or handcuffs, gag them with tape, and then spend hours torturing them. The torture wasn't frenzied or passionate. It was methodical, calculated, designed to maximize both physical pain and psychological terror. Richard later described his crimes in chillingly clinical terms. I was able to get almost any woman to do whatever I wanted them to do, psychologically, he said decades after his conviction. It's godlike, almost. You're in complete control of somebody's destiny. The psychological component was crucial to his satisfaction. Richard didn't just want to kill. He wanted to dominate completely, to strip away every shred of dignity and humanity from his victims before ending their lives. He would tell them they were worthless, that they deserved what was happening to them. The fear in their eyes, the pleading, the gradual breaking of their spirit was what he craved most. After killing his victims, usually by strangulation, Richard would often mutilate their bodies. He would remove heads and hands to prevent identification, sometimes keeping these body parts as trophies. In some cases, he would set the bodies on fire, erasing evidence and adding one final indignity to their deaths. On December 15th, 1977, Richard abducted 26-year-old Marianne Carr from the parking lot of her apartment complex in Little Ferry, New Jersey. Carr was a newlywed and an X-ray technician at a local hospital. She had just returned home from work, poured herself a glass of wine, and was looking through her mail when Richard struck. A neighbor later reported hearing a woman scream and the words, I will, coming from the direction of Carr's apartment around 7:45 p.m. Richard took Carr to a Quality Inn motel where he tortured and killed her over the course of several hours. Her body was found the next day in the motel parking lot, showing clear signs of prolonged torture. The brutality was so extreme that even seasoned detectives were shaken by the crime scene. Throughout this period, Richard's marriage was deteriorating. Janet had grown suspicious of her husband's late nights and secretive behavior. She'd found the apartment in New York City filled with women's belongings. She'd discovered that Richard was having multiple affairs. In 1978, she filed for divorce, citing abandonment and mental cruelty. But she would later withdraw the petition, perhaps not fully understanding the monster she was married to. The killings escalated in 1979. On December 2nd, Richard lured two women to the Travel Inn Motor Hotel near Times Square. One was 22-year-old Dide Goodarzi, an Iranian immigrant working as a sex worker. The other woman has never been identified, known only as Jane Doe. Richard spent days torturing both women in room 417 before killing them. Then, in an act of theatrical cruelty, he severed their heads and hands, packed the body parts into a suitcase, and set the torsos on fire before calmly walking out of the hotel. It was this double murder that earned Richard his infamous nickname. The headless, handless torsos found in the burning hotel room captured the attention of New York media, who dubbed the unknown killer the Torso Killer and the Times Square Ripper. But Richard wasn't done. On May 5th, 1980, he killed 19-year-old Valerie Ann Street at the same Quality Inn where he'd murdered Marianne Carr. Street's body showed the same pattern of torture and mutilation that had become Richard's signature. 2 weeks later, he murdered 25-year-old Jean Rayner at Manhattan's Seville Hotel, cutting her throat and setting her body on fire. By this point, police across New York and New Jersey were beginning to connect the dots. The murders shared too many similarities to be coincidental. The same methods, the same locations, the same type of victims. But Richard was careful, methodical. He left no fingerprints, no DNA evidence, no witnesses. He was a ghost, moving through the neon-lit underbelly of the city. His downfall came on May 22nd, 1980, at the same Quality Inn where he'd killed Carr and Street. Richard had lured 18-year-old Leslie Ann Odell to the motel, intending to make her his next victim. But this time, something went wrong. Odell's screams grew loud enough that a maid heard them from the hallway. When the maid went to investigate, Odell desperately signaled for help. Police arrived to find Richard attempting to flee the scene, carrying a bag filled with his tools, handcuffs, knives, rope, and various torture devices. Odell was found bound and gagged, showing signs of hours of torture, but she was alive. For the first time in his 13-year killing spree, Richard had left a witness. At his arrest, Richard was calm, almost relieved. When questioned, he made a chilling admission. "I'm the one you're looking for. I've done this before." But even as he confessed to being the killer police had been hunting, the true scope of his crimes was only beginning to emerge. During the investigation, police discovered that Richard had been living a double life with stunning audacity. He'd maintained his job at Blue Cross Blue Shield throughout his killing spree, showing up to work each day as if nothing had happened. His colleagues described him as quiet and competent, never suspecting that the man fixing their computers was also dismembering women in hotel rooms across the city. At his trials in the early 1980s, the full horror of Richard's crimes was revealed. Leslie Ann Odell, the young woman who'd survived his final attack, testified about her ordeal. "He told me to shut up, that I was a whore and I had to be punished," she said. "He said the other girls took it, and I had to take it too. He said that uncountable times." The prosecution painted a picture of a man who had completely compartmentalized his life, able to switch between devoted family man and sadistic killer with terrifying ease. Richard showed no emotion during the proceedings, displaying the same cold detachment that had characterized his crimes. In 1984, Richard was convicted of 5 murders and sentenced to multiple life terms. But even as he sat in prison, detectives suspected he was responsible for many more killings. Richard himself would later claim to have murdered between 80 and 100 women, though the exact number may never be known. For decades, Richard maintained his innocence regarding the crimes for which he'd been convicted, claiming he'd been framed. But in 2009, perhaps facing his own mortality, he finally admitted the truth. Not only had he committed the 5 murders, but he'd killed many more. Starting in 2010, Richard began confessing to additional murders in exchange for immunity from prosecution. Working with Detective Robert Anzalotti of the Bergen County Prosecutor's Office, he admitted to killing Nancy Vogel in 1967, 13-year-old Jacqueline Harp in 1968, and teenagers Irene Blas and Denise Velasca in 1969. In 2021, Richard confessed to one of his most horrific crimes, the 1974 murders of 16-year-old Lorraine Kelly and 17-year-old Mary Ann Pryor. The two friends had been heading to a mall to buy bathing suits when Richard abducted them. He took them to a motel where he tortured them for hours before drowning them in the bathtub. As recently as 2022, Richard continued confessing to murders, including the 1968 rape and murder of 23-year-old Diane Cusick, a dance instructor and mother who was killed in the parking lot of a Long Island shopping mall. Each confession brought some measure of closure to families who had waited decades for answers. What drove Richard Cottingham to commit such unspeakable acts remains a mystery. Unlike many serial killers, he didn't suffer obvious childhood trauma or abuse. He came from a stable home, had a successful career, and maintained a family. Yet somewhere in the depths of his psyche, something had gone terribly wrong. Richard himself has offered little insight into his motivations. In rare interviews, he's described his crimes as mainly psychological and called murder a game. He's spoken about the godlike feeling of having complete control over another person's life and death. But these explanations feel hollow, inadequate to explain the depth of his cruelty. What's perhaps most chilling about Richard Cottingham is how ordinary he appeared. He lived among us, worked beside us, raised children, and paid taxes and mowed his lawn. He was the ultimate wolf in sheep's clothing, proof that evil doesn't always announce itself with the obvious signs. Today, Richard Cottingham sits in New Jersey State Prison, serving multiple life sentences. He's 76 years old and in failing health. As detectives race against time to solve cold cases, Richard continues to dole out confessions like bargaining chips, maintaining control even from his prison cell. For the families of his victims, each confession brings a mixture of closure and renewed pain. They finally have answers to questions that have haunted them for decades, but those answers come at the cost of learning the horrific details of how their loved ones died. Richard Cottingham represents something particularly disturbing in the annals of American crime. He was not the product of obvious pathology or clear warning signs. He was an ordinary man who chose to become a monster, who spent 13 years methodically destroying lives while maintaining the facade of suburban respectability. His story serves as a chilling reminder that evil can hide behind the most mundane appearances, that the capacity for unthinkable cruelty can lurk beneath the surface of even the most ordinary-seeming lives. In the end, Richard Cottingham earned his place among history's most notorious killers, not just through the number of his victims, but through the calculated, remorseless nature of his crimes. The Torso Killer's legacy is one of terror disguised as normalcy, of evil hiding in plain sight. He reminds us that monsters don't always look like monsters, and that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who blend seamlessly into the crowd, waiting for darkness to reveal their true nature. In the early morning hours of August 7th, 1987, screams pierced the silence of a Denny's restaurant parking lot in Oak Grove, Oregon. Witnesses rushing toward the sound found a scene that would haunt them forever. A woman, naked and bound, bleeding from multiple stab wounds as a man calmly walked away from his pickup truck. But this wasn't a crime of passion or a robbery gone wrong. This was the moment when one of Oregon's most methodical killers made his fatal mistake, the moment Dayton Leroy Rogers finally revealed himself to the world. For years, women had been disappearing from the streets of Portland. They were society's forgotten, sex workers, drug addicts, runaways, people whose absence rarely triggered investigations, whose lives were deemed disposable by a system that had already failed them. What no one realized was that these disappearances weren't random acts of street violence or overdoses gone wrong. They were the systematic hunting of a predator who had turned murder into both ritual and obsession. Born on September 30th, 1953, in Idaho, Dayton Leroy Rogers entered the world during an era when the darkness lurking in suburban America remained largely hidden behind white picket fences and Sunday dinners. His early years were marked by instability, a childhood where neglect and violence planted seeds that would later bloom into something monstrous. Rogers grew up in a household where emotional warmth was scarce and discipline was harsh. The family moved frequently, never allowing young Dayton to form meaningful connections or develop a stable sense of identity. Teachers remembered him as a quiet, withdrawn child who seemed to fade into the background, neither causing trouble nor seeking attention. But beneath this unremarkable exterior, something twisted was taking shape. As a teenager, Rogers began exhibiting the warning signs that would later become all too familiar to criminal psychologists. He was cruel to animals, torturing neighborhood pets with the same cold precision he would later apply to human victims. He set fires, watching with fascination as flames consumed everything in their path. Most disturbing of all, he began stalking women, following them home from school or work, learning their routines, their vulnerabilities. By his early 20s, Rogers had settled into a life that appeared utterly normal on the surface. He married, had a child, and worked as a small engine mechanic in the Portland area. To his neighbors, he was just another working-class family man, quiet but reliable, the kind of person who fixed your lawnmower and waved from his driveway. But this facade of normalcy masked a growing obsession with violence and control. Rogers had developed what would become his signature calling card, a bizarre fetish for women's feet. This wasn't merely a sexual preference, but something far more sinister, a psychological compulsion that would drive him to commit acts of unthinkable brutality. In his mind, feet represented power, control, and possession. To take them was to own his victims completely, even in death. Financial pressures began mounting in Rogers' life during the mid-1980s. His small engine repair business struggled, bills piled up, and the weight of his debts crushed down on him. But rather than seeking help or finding legitimate solutions, Rogers turned to the darkness that had always lurked beneath his surface. The stress didn't break him, it freed him to become what he had always been destined to become. His hunting ground became the streets of Portland, particularly the areas where desperate women sold their bodies to survive. Rogers understood that these women existed in the shadows of society, that their disappearances would be attributed to the dangers of their lifestyle rather than a systematic predator. He chose them not out of convenience, but out of a calculated understanding of how little their lives were valued. Rogers' method was as simple as it was terrifying. He would cruise the streets in his pickup truck, often late at night or in the early morning hours, searching for women who appeared vulnerable and isolated. His approach was deceptively friendly. He would offer money, a ride, sometimes even genuine kindness. To his victims, he probably seemed like a rare decent customer in a world full of dangerous men. Once he had lured them into his truck, Rogers would drive to secluded areas, often heading toward the dense forests outside Malala, Oregon. The location wasn't chosen randomly. Rogers knew these woods intimately, had spent time there hunting animals before he began hunting humans. The forest provided the perfect combination of isolation and familiarity that he needed for what came next. What happened in those woods defies comprehension. Rogers didn't simply kill his victims. He tortured them with a methodical cruelty that spoke to the depths of his psychological damage. He would bind them with rope, preventing any chance of escape, then begin a ritual of violence that could last for hours. Using knives and Most horrifically, a hacksaw. He would systematically mutilate his victims while they were still alive. The foot amputation was always part of his ritual. Rogers would carefully saw off his victims' feet at the ankle, often while they were still conscious and aware. This wasn't done in a frenzy of violence, but with the cold precision of a surgeon. He took his time, savoring both the physical and psychological power he held over these women in their final moments. After killing his victims, Rogers would arrange their bodies in poses that satisfied some twisted aesthetic in his mind. He scattered personal items throughout the forest: clothing, shoes, pieces of rope, like grotesque decorations marking his territory. Most chilling of all, he would leave behind empty vodka bottles and orange juice containers, the remnants of the screwdrivers he mixed to calm his nerves during and after his murders. Between 1985 and 1987, at least 7 women fell victim to Rogers' methodical brutality. Each disappearance was initially treated as just another casualty of life on the streets. Lisa Marie Mock, 23 years old, vanished one night and was never seen alive again. Maureen Ann Hodges, 26, left behind friends who knew something terrible had happened but could never prove it. Christine Lotus Adams, 35, disappeared into the same dark void that had swallowed the others. Cynthia DeVore, just 20 years old, had her whole life ahead of her when she encountered Rogers. Nondescript and Maureen Vianette, whose very names have been nearly forgotten by history, had joined the growing list of women whose lives were reduced to crime scene photographs and police reports. Reatha Giles and Diana Luders completed the known count of Rogers' victims, though investigators suspected there were others whose bodies were never found. The forest began to give up its secrets on August 31st, 1987, when a hunter stumbled upon the decomposing remains of a woman beneath a carpet of ferns. The discovery sent shockwaves through the local police department and triggered one of the most intensive criminal investigations in Oregon's history. Over the following days, investigators combed through acres of dense woodland, uncovering body after body in various stages of decomposition. The crime scene was a testament to Rogers' systematic approach to murder. Bodies were found scattered throughout a relatively small area, suggesting he had used this location repeatedly as his personal killing ground. The remains told a horrific story of torture, mutilation, and prolonged suffering. Almost all of the victims had been stabbed multiple times, and the evidence suggested they had been alive during much of their ordeal. Most disturbing of all were the amputated feet. Investigators found evidence that Rogers had used a hacksaw to carefully remove his victims' feet, often taking them as trophies. The precision of these amputations, combined with the positioning of the bodies, painted a picture of a killer who took both time and care in his work. This wasn't the frenzied violence of a man who had lost control. This was the methodical brutality of someone who had found his true calling. The investigation might have gone on for months or even years, if not for Rogers' final, fatal mistake. On that August morning in 1987, something went wrong with his usual routine. Perhaps the stress of the ongoing investigation had made him sloppy, or perhaps his confidence had grown so great that he believed himself untouchable. Whatever the reason, when he picked up 25-year-old Jennifer Lisa Smith and drove her to that Denny's parking lot, he chose to indulge his violent fantasies in public. Witnesses later described the horrific scene inside Rogers' truck. Smith was naked and bound, and Rogers was methodically stabbing her in the breasts, abdomen, and back. Her screams drew the attention of other people in the parking lot, who rushed toward the truck believing they might be able to help. Rogers initially fled on foot, but then returned to his vehicle and drove away at high speed, apparently unconcerned that multiple witnesses had seen his face and recorded his license plate number. The high-speed chase that followed was like something out of a movie. One witness, determined to see justice done, followed Rogers through multiple towns at speeds reaching 100 miles per hour. When Rogers finally pulled into a driveway in Canby, the witness carefully noted the address before driving to the nearest phone to alert police. Within hours, investigators had Rogers' name, address, and a clear connection to the Malala Forest murders. The evidence against Rogers was overwhelming. Blood found in his truck matched that of multiple victims. Fibers from victims' clothing were discovered in his wood stove, where he had apparently burned evidence. Most damning of all, tool mark analysis proved that the hacksaw found in his possession was the same one used to amputate his victim's feet. The forensic case was so strong that even Rogers' defense team knew they were fighting a losing battle. During questioning, Rogers displayed the same cold detachment that had characterized his crimes. He showed no remorse for his victims, no understanding of the suffering he had caused. To him, these women had been objects to be used and discarded, no different from the engines he repaired in his day job. His only regret seemed to be that he had been caught. The trial that followed revealed the full scope of Rogers' depravity to a shocked community. Witnesses testified about the horrific crime scene, the evidence of torture, and the methodical nature of the murders. The jury heard about empty vodka bottles found with the bodies, about the careful way Rogers had posed his victims, about the trophies he had taken. Most difficult of all, they heard Jennifer Smith's account of her survival, her voice trembling as she described the longest night of her life. Rogers was convicted on multiple counts of aggravated murder and sentenced to death. The judge, in handing down the sentence, called the crimes among the most heinous he had ever encountered. Rogers showed no emotion as the verdict was read, maintaining the same blank expression that had characterized his entire trial. But the legal system proved almost as frustrating as Rogers himself. Over the following decades, his death sentence was overturned multiple times on various technicalities. Appeals dragged on for years, each reversal reopening wounds for the families of his victims. In 2022, when Oregon's governor commuted all death sentences to life without parole, Rogers finally received what many believed should have been his original sentence. The case left deep scars on the Portland community and law enforcement agencies involved in the investigation. The Malala Forest became synonymous with horror, a place where families could no longer imagine taking weekend hikes or camping trips. The investigation had revealed uncomfortable truths about how society treats its most vulnerable members and how easily predators can exploit that neglect. For the families of Rogers' victims, the resolution brought little comfort. These women had been daughters, sisters, friends, people with hopes and dreams who had been reduced to crime scene evidence. Their deaths highlighted the dangerous invisibility of sex workers and drug addicts, the way society's judgment can make certain lives seem expendable. Rogers' case also revealed disturbing patterns about serial killers and their relationship with normalcy. Here was a man who had maintained a marriage, held down a job, and lived in a suburban neighborhood while simultaneously torturing and murdering women in the woods. His ability to compartmentalize his life spoke to a level of psychological dysfunction that experts are still trying to understand. The foot fetish that drove Rogers to commit his most heinous acts remains one of the most disturbing aspects of his psychology. Unlike killers who are driven by rage or sexual sadism, Rogers seemed motivated by a need to possess and control that went beyond death itself. The careful amputation of his victims' feet wasn't just mutilation, it was his way of ensuring that they could never escape him, even in death. Today, Dayton Leroy Rogers sits in an Oregon prison cell, serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole. At 71 years old, he will almost certainly die behind bars, his name remembered only as a footnote in the annals of criminal history. But for those who knew his victims, who investigated his crimes, or who lived through the terror he brought to their community, his impact continues to resonate. The case serves as a grim reminder of the monsters that can hide behind masks of normalcy, the predators who walk among us wearing the faces of ordinary men. Rogers proved that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious warning signs or dramatic gestures. Sometimes it comes quietly, methodically, wearing the face of a neighbor or a mechanic or a family man. His story also highlights the ongoing vulnerability of society's most marginalized members. The women Rogers killed were not chosen randomly. They were selected because he understood that their deaths would be met with less investigation, less public outcry, less demand for justice. Their lives were deemed disposable by a society that had already failed them long before they encountered their killer. In the end, Dayton Leroy Rogers represents something more terrifying than a simple monster. He represents the capacity for calculated evil that exists within the human psyche, the ability to transform ordinary suburban normalcy into a hunting ground for the unspeakable. His crimes remind us that the most dangerous predators are often those who appear most harmless, and that the line between civilization and savagery is far thinner than most of us would like to believe. The Malala forest has begun to heal from the horrors it witnessed, new growth covering the spots where Rogers committed his atrocities. But the memory of what happened there lingers, a dark chapter in Oregon's history that serves as both warning and remembrance. For the families of his victims, and for a community that learned terrible truths about human nature, the healing will take much longer. Rogers' legacy is not one of infamy or notoriety, but of the quiet, methodical evil that can flourish when society looks away from its most vulnerable members. His story serves as a reminder that monsters are real, that they walk among us, and that they often wear the most ordinary faces of all. In November 1993, on a quiet street in Culver City, California, a passerby noticed something deeply unsettling. A man calmly pushing a shopping cart down the sidewalk. But this wasn't a homeless person collecting bottles or an ordinary shopper heading home. Inside that cart, bound with ropes and secured with torn cloth, was the lifeless body of 29-year-old Jamie Harrington. The man pushing the cart seemed utterly at peace with his gruesome cargo, as if transporting a corpse through suburban streets was just another Tuesday afternoon. When police arrived, they found Michael Hughes attempting to dispose of Jamie's body in a parking lot. He didn't run. He didn't resist. He simply stood there with that same eerie calm, as if he'd been expecting them all along. What investigators didn't know at the time was that this shopping cart arrest would unravel one of Los Angeles's most chilling and methodical killing sprees, a 7-year reign of terror that claimed the lives of 7 women. Michael Hubert Hughes was born in 1958 in Michigan, but his story doesn't begin with the usual childhood trauma we expect from serial killers. Instead, it starts with absence. His father vanished when Michael was just an infant, leaving behind a mother who would soon relocate to California with her 2 children when Michael turned 5. They settled first in Pasadena, then moved to Los Angeles, where Michael would spend his formative years attending Los Angeles High School. But behind the facade of a normal childhood lurked something far more sinister. Michael's mother wasn't just absent emotionally, she was actively destructive. An alcoholic with a violent temper, she regularly beat both Michael and his sister with a brutality that went far beyond discipline. The house that should have been a sanctuary became a war zone where children lived in constant fear. Then came the moment that may have shattered whatever innocence remained in young Michael's psyche. When his sister became pregnant, their mother made a decision that would haunt the family forever. She performed an abortion on her daughter right there in their home, forcing Michael to witness the entire horrific procedure. Imagine being a child and watching your mother destroy life with the same hands that were supposed to nurture it. The psychological damage from that single moment was profound and irreversible. The trauma manifested in nervous breakdowns throughout Michael's teenage years. He was hospitalized multiple times as his mind struggled to process the violence and chaos that defined his daily existence. Teachers and counselors saw a quiet, withdrawn boy who seemed to be disappearing into himself. What they couldn't see was the rage building beneath the surface, the seed of something dark taking root in soil that had been poisoned by years of abuse and neglect. At 17, Michael enlisted in the Navy, perhaps hoping that military structure could provide the stability his home never offered. He served as a machinist, learning technical skills and discipline. For a brief moment, it seemed like he might find a different path. But when his service ended, Michael returned to Los Angeles, and that's when everything began to unravel. Unable to find steady work or housing, Michael became homeless, living on the streets of the very city where his childhood had been destroyed. To survive, he turned to selling drugs, moving through Oakland to Long Beach before finally settling back in Los Angeles. It was during this period of desperation and invisibility that Michael Hughes began to kill. His first confirmed victim was 15-year-old Yvonne Coleman. On January 22, 1986, Yvonne had skipped school to spend time with her boyfriend. She was walking home when Michael encountered her near a park in Inglewood. What happened next was a brutal sexual assault followed by strangulation. Michael left her body near a barbecue pit, grass stuffed in her mouth and throat, just a few blocks from where he was living at the time. The positioning was deliberate, designed to shock whoever discovered her. This wasn't a crime of passion or a moment of lost control. This was calculated, methodical, and performed with a chilling detachment that would become Michael's signature. He had crossed a line that most people can't even imagine approaching, and once he did, killing became easier each time. 5 months later, on May 26, 1986, 36-year-old Verna Williams was found strangled on the grounds of 68th Street Elementary School in Los Angeles. Her partially nude body had been carefully positioned, another deliberate shock for whoever found her. At the time, police believed she was the victim of the Southside Slayer, a serial killer who was terrorizing South Los Angeles. They had no idea that multiple killers were operating in the same area, hunting the same type of victims. Michael's victims weren't random selections. He deliberately targeted vulnerable women, those living on the streets, involved in sex work, or struggling with addiction. These were women society often overlooked, which made them perfect prey for a predator who understood how to remain invisible. He knew that when these women disappeared, there wouldn't be massive search parties or media attention. They would simply vanish, becoming another statistic in a city where over 1,000 murders were committed each year. Between 1986 and 1993, Michael Hughes operated with terrifying efficiency. He would stalk his victims, often observing them for days to learn their routines. When he struck, it was swift and brutal. He would sexually assault them, strangle them with his bare hands, and then position their bodies in provocative poses designed to maximize the psychological impact on whoever discovered them. According to Detective Cliff Shepard, who would later investigate the cold cases, Michael's signature was his need to shock. He is trying to shock whoever finds the body, Shepard explained. We suspect there was some incident in his life that set his actions in motion, and he later decided to take it out on a number of women. That incident was likely the witnessed abortion of his sister, a traumatic event that may have twisted his understanding of women and life itself. In 1990, Michael murdered Deanna Wilson in her own garage while her young son slept in a nearby bedroom. The violation of a family home, the proximity to an innocent child, these details reveal a killer who was becoming increasingly bold and sadistic. He no longer just hunted on the streets. He was bringing death into the supposed safety of people's homes. By 1992, Michael had found work in various odd jobs around Los Angeles. He sold Christmas trees near LAX, worked as a security guard, and even did moving jobs for a company called Starving Students. This legitimate work provided him with cover and access to potential victims. On September 23, 1992, he murdered 26-year-old Teresa Ballard, leaving her body in Jesse Owens County Park. The following year brought a rapid escalation. In June 1993, Michael killed Deborah Jackson, dumping her partially nude body in a trash container near where he was working for the moving company. Just months later, he murdered Brenda Bradley, Terry Miles, and finally Jamie Harrington. It was Jamie's murder that revealed Michael's growing recklessness and possible psychological deterioration. Instead of simply dumping her body like the others, he bound her to a shopping cart with ropes and torn cloth, then calmly wheeled her through the streets of Culver City in broad daylight. This wasn't just about disposing of evidence anymore. This was about displaying his work, forcing the world to witness what he had done. The eyewitness who spotted Michael with the shopping cart provided police with a detailed description. When they arrested him in December 1993, they found his fingerprints on the cart and discovered paperwork with his name at one of the crime scenes. The evidence was overwhelming, but Michael maintained his innocence, claiming he had only had consensual sexual encounters with the women. In 1998, Michael was convicted of 4 murders and sentenced to life without parole. But the story didn't end there. In 2008, advances in DNA technology allowed cold case detectives to link Michael to 3 additional murders from the 1980s. The DNA evidence was conclusive, proving what investigators had long suspected, that Michael Hughes was responsible for far more deaths than initially believed. At his second trial in 2011, prosecutors painted a picture of a methodical predator who had terrorized Los Angeles for 7 years. The jury heard about the shopping cart, the posed bodies, the deliberate targeting of vulnerable women. They learned about his traumatic childhood, his mother's abuse, the witnessed abortion that may have triggered his lifelong rage against women. Michael's defense team argued for life without parole, citing his horrific upbringing as a mitigating factor. They described a child who had been brutalized and traumatized, arguing that his crimes were the inevitable result of the violence that had shaped his entire existence. But the jury wasn't swayed. In June 2012, Michael Hughes was sentenced to death. Today, at 67 years old, Michael Hughes sits on death row at High Desert State Prison in Susanville, California. He has never shown remorse for his crimes, never apologized to the families of his victims. In interviews, he continues to deny his guilt, maintaining that he was simply unlucky enough to have sexual encounters with women who later turned up dead. But the evidence tells a different story. It tells the story of a man who turned his childhood trauma into a weapon against innocent women. It reveals a killer who understood exactly what he was doing, who planned his crimes carefully, and who took pleasure in the shock and horror his actions would cause. Michael Hughes represents something terrifying about human nature, the capacity for someone who suffered as a child to become the inflictor of suffering as an adult. His crimes weren't the result of a moment of madness or a sudden break from reality. They were the product of years of methodical planning and execution by someone who had learned to find power in causing pain. The shopping cart that led to his arrest has become a symbol of his twisted psychology. The idea that he could transport death through ordinary suburban streets, that he could make the unthinkable seem mundane. In that single image, we see everything that made Michael Hughes so dangerous: his ability to hide in plain sight, his complete disconnect from normal human empathy, and his need to force society to confront the evil he was capable of. The women he killed, Yvonne Coleman, Verna Williams, Deborah Jackson, Teresa Ballard, Brenda Bradley, Terry Miles, and Jamie Harrington, they weren't just statistics or victims. They were human beings with hopes, fears, and families who loved them. Their murders devastated not just their immediate families, but entire communities that lived in fear during Michael's 7-year reign of terror. Michael Hughes may never have achieved the notoriety of more famous serial killers, but his crimes were no less horrific. He proved that monsters don't always announce themselves with dramatic gestures or theatrical displays. Sometimes they push shopping carts down quiet streets, hiding their evil behind a mask of normalcy until that moment when the mask finally slips away. In the early morning hours of August 28th, 1997, two college students walked hand in hand along railroad tracks in Lexington, Kentucky, returning from a party. The night air was warm, filled with the sounds of distant laughter and the rhythmic clicking of cooling metal rails beneath their feet. Christopher Meyer, 21, and his girlfriend Holly Dunn, 20, had no idea they were being watched from the shadows, stalked by a man who would forever change their understanding of human evil. Within minutes, their carefree evening would explode into unimaginable horror. Christopher would be dead, his skull crushed with a piece of railroad track. Holly would be left for dead, raped, beaten, and left to die beside the very rails that had carried her attacker across the country like some demonic spirit of the American landscape. The man who destroyed their lives had no name they would recognize, no face they could have picked from a crowd. He was a ghost who rode the rails, appearing and disappearing like smoke, leaving behind a trail of shattered lives and unspeakable crimes. They called him the Railroad Killer, but his real name was Angel Maturino Resendiz, and he was about to become one of the most feared serial killers in American history. But to understand the monster, you have to understand the child he once was, a boy whose life began with violence the moment he drew his first breath. Angel Leoncio Reyes Resendiz was born on August 1st, 1959, in Izúcar de Matamoros, a dusty city in the Mexican state of Puebla. His arrival into the world was as traumatic as the life that would follow. During a difficult birth attended by a midwife, the newborn was dropped on his head, leaving him unconscious and purple. His mother, Virginia, watched in horror as her son's life began with a blow that may have forever altered the course of his brain development. The accident set the tone for what would become a childhood defined by abandonment, abuse, and violence. His father, Juan, never married Virginia and disappeared from the boy's life entirely, leaving behind a woman ill-equipped to handle the challenges of raising a damaged child alone. Angel grew up small for his age, timid, and described by relatives as a loner who seemed perpetually detached from the world around him. When Angel was 3, tragedy struck again. He fell from a building, suffering serious injuries that further damaged his already fragile psychological state. But the physical injuries were nothing compared to the emotional and sexual trauma that would follow. At age 6, Virginia sent her son to live with his maternal uncle, a decision that would prove catastrophic. The uncle, who was supposed to provide stability and care, instead became Angel's first predator. In a home where he should have found safety, the boy was repeatedly raped and abused. To make matters worse, a local pedophile also gained access to the child, adding another layer of sexual trauma to an already shattered psyche. The boy, who had once been merely neglected, was now being systematically destroyed by the very adults who were supposed to protect him. By age 11, the psychological damage was complete. Unable to endure the continued abuse, Angel ran away from home and began living on the streets, a decision that, for a child so young, represented both desperation and a twisted form of survival instinct. On the streets, he found a different kind of destruction, Glue sniffing became his escape, a chemical buffer against a reality too painful to bear. The damaged child, wandering the streets of Mexico, was already developing the rage and detachment that would later fuel his killing spree. Every betrayal, every act of violence perpetrated against him was creating neural pathways of anger and disconnection that would prove nearly impossible to break. At 16, driven by some mixture of hope and desperation, Angel attempted to cross into Texas, the first of what would become dozens of illegal border crossings throughout his life. He was caught and deported, but something about the experience had hooked him. America represented possibility, even for someone as damaged as he had become. This began a pattern that would define the rest of his life, a relentless cycle of crossing into the United States, getting arrested for various crimes, serving time in American prisons, being deported back to Mexico, and then crossing again. Each time he returned, he seemed to carry more anger, more resentment, and a growing sense that the world owed him something for all the pain he had endured. In 1988, he spent time in St. Louis, working for a temp agency and trying to blend into American society. But normalcy was impossible for someone carrying the psychological scars he bore. His criminal record began to grow: assault, auto theft, firearm possession, burglary. Each crime was a step towards something darker, each arrest and deportation adding fuel to a fire that was beginning to burn out of control. By adulthood, Angel had spent 11 years in American prisons, but instead of rehabilitation, each incarceration seemed to harden him further. He met other violent criminals, absorbed their techniques, and began to develop a twisted worldview that would later drive him to murder. Prison became his university, and violence was his major. But it was his relationship with trains that would ultimately define his murderous career. Perhaps it was the freedom they represented, the ability to move invisibly across vast distances without documentation or detection. Or maybe it was the rhythmic, hypnotic quality of the rails that appealed to his damaged psyche. Whatever the reason, Angel became expert at stowing away on freight trains, learning to ride the rails like a deadly phantom across the American landscape. By 1986, the psychological transformation was complete. The abused child had become something far more dangerous, a predator. His first known murder occurred that year, a homeless woman and her boyfriend killed with the casual brutality that would become his signature. But this was just the beginning. In 1991, he crossed into the United States again and committed his first confirmed murder on American soil. The victim was Michael White, a 33-year-old man in Kentucky whom Angel beat to death with a brick. The murder was savage, personal, and seemed to unlock something in Angel that had been building for years. The act of taking a life didn't horrify him, it empowered him. From that moment forward, Angel Maturino Resendiz became a different kind of predator. He began traveling systematically by freight train, hopping off in small towns and cities across America, always looking for the same thing: homes near railroad tracks, occupied by people who wouldn't be missed immediately. He had found his hunting ground. His method was as calculating as it was brutal. He would scout neighborhoods near train tracks, looking for isolated homes where he could strike without being observed. His preferred weapons were objects he found at the scene: rocks, hammers, pickaxes, kitchen knives, tools that couldn't be traced back to him and that added a level of intimate violence to each murder. But what made Angel particularly terrifying wasn't just his brutality, it was his behavior after the killings. He would linger in his victims' homes for hours, sometimes days, eating their food, studying their personal belongings, and laying out their driver's licenses to learn about their lives. It was as if he was trying to understand something about normalcy, about the lives he could never have. He took jewelry and sentimental items, sending them to his wife and mother back in Mexico, as if these stolen pieces of other people's lives could somehow fill the void in his own existence. Sometimes he left money at the scene, a gesture that seemed to indicate some twisted sense of fairness or perhaps guilt. The psychological profile that emerged was of a man driven by contradictory impulses. He raped some of his female victims, but sexual gratification seemed secondary to his need for control and domination. He was careful to choose victims who couldn't overpower him. His own small stature made him cautious about whom he attacked. This wasn't mindless violence. It was calculated predation by someone who understood his own limitations. Between 1991 and 1999, Angel Reséndez became a ghost story come to life. He murdered at least 15 people across 6 states: Texas, Kentucky, Georgia, Illinois, Florida, and California, and investigators believe the real number may have been much higher. Each murder was committed near railroad tracks, each victim chosen for their vulnerability and isolation. In October 1998, he killed 87-year-old Leafy Mason in her Hughes Springs, Texas home, beating her to death with an iron. The level of violence was shocking even by his standards. The elderly woman never had a chance against his rage. In June 1999, he murdered 80-year-old George Morber in Gorham, Illinois, shooting him in the back of the head with a shotgun. When Morber's 57-year-old daughter, Carolyn Frederick, arrived, Angel didn't hesitate. He beat her to death with the shotgun, striking her with such force that the weapon broke into 2 pieces. Then, in an act of supreme cruelty, he sexually assaulted her dead body. But it was the attack on Christopher Meyer and Holly Dunn that would ultimately lead to his capture. The young couple represented everything Angel had been denied: youth, love, hope, a future filled with possibility. When he saw them walking along those railroad tracks, something in his damaged psyche snapped. He approached them with a rock, crushing Christopher's skull with methodical brutality while Holly watched in horror. Then he turned his attention to her, raping and beating her before leaving her for dead beside the tracks. But Holly Dunn possessed something that Angel had never encountered in his victims: an unbreakable will to survive. Despite suffering a shattered jaw, a fractured eye socket, and numerous cuts to her face and head, Holly managed to crawl to safety and alert authorities. For the first time in his killing career, Angel Reséndez had left behind a living witness, someone who could describe his face, his voice, his methods. The FBI task force that formed to catch the railroad killer was unlike anything law enforcement had ever assembled. They distributed flyers across the country, added him to the 10 most wanted list alongside Osama bin Laden, and coordinated a nationwide manhunt that involved stopping trains and searching rail yards from coast to coast. But Angel remained elusive, aided by his years of experience, traveling invisibly through America's vast railroad network. What made the search even more difficult was his habit of using multiple names and identities. For years, authorities believed they were looking for Rafael Resendez Ramirez, not knowing his real name was Angel Maturino Resendez. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: his own family. His sister Manuela, living in Albuquerque, New Mexico, saw his picture on the FBI's most wanted poster and realized the monster they were hunting was her brother. Torn between family loyalty and moral obligation, she began secret negotiations with Texas Ranger Drew Carter. The conversations that followed revealed the complexity of Angel's psychological state. He was tired, paranoid, and increasingly isolated. The pressure of being hunted by two nations had begun to crack even his hardened psyche. Through his sister, he began exploring the possibility of surrender. On July 13th, 1999, on a bridge connecting El Paso, Texas, with Ciudad Juarez, Mexico, one of America's most wanted fugitives walked calmly into custody. The man who had terrorized communities across 6 states for over a decade simply gave up, exhausted by a life of violence and flight. In court, Angel Resendez presented a disturbing figure. Prosecutor Devin Anderson described him as having flat black and expressionless eyes, like someone had taken a black magic marker and colored them. There was no humanity visible, no emotion, just a void where a soul should have been. His defense team attempted an insanity plea, arguing that he was a paranoid schizophrenic who believed himself to be an angel avenging God by killing people he deemed evil. They claimed he targeted those he believed were gay and people who performed abortions, operating under the delusion that he was carrying out divine justice. But prosecutors painted a different picture. They argued that Angel's crimes were motivated not by delusion, but by anger, power, the desire for sex, the desire for control and domination. The evidence was overwhelming. DNA linked him conclusively to multiple crime scenes, and Holly Dunn's testimony provided a first-hand account of his calculated brutality. The jury deliberated for 10 hours before reaching their verdict: guilty of capital murder. The sentence was death. Even on death row, Angel continued to display the psychological fragmentation that had driven his crimes. He claimed to be half man and half angel, insisting that he couldn't be executed because he couldn't die. "I don't believe in death," he told the court. "I know the body is going to go to waste. But me, as a person, I'm eternal. I'm going to be alive forever." During his time in prison, he wrote letters filled with drawings of angels, a chilling echo of his own name. Some letters were 10 pages long, written in broken English, describing how he had evaded capture and watched authorities search for him. The letters revealed a man still trapped in the grandiose delusions that had fueled his killing spree. On June 27, 2006, Angel Maturino Resendez was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas. In his final statement, he seemed to glimpse, for perhaps the first time, the magnitude of what he had done. "I want to ask if it is in your heart to forgive me," he said. "I know I allowed the devil to rule my life. I deserve what I am getting." But even in those final moments, the psychological damage that had shaped his entire existence was visible. He spoke of the devil ruling his life, unable to take full responsibility for the choices he had made. The abused child was still there, still looking for someone else to blame for the monster he had become. George Benton, whose wife Claudia had been one of Angel's victims, was present at the execution. His words captured the essence of what Angel had become: evil contained in human form, a creature without a soul, no conscience, no sense of remorse, no regard for the sanctity of human life. Holly Dunn, the sole survivor of the railroad killer's attacks, went on to dedicate her life to helping other victims of sexual violence. She founded Holly's House, a nonprofit advocacy center, transforming her trauma into a force for healing and justice. Her survival and advocacy work represents something that Angel Resendiz never understood: the human capacity to transform suffering into strength. The story of Angel Maturino Resendiz is ultimately a story about the intersection of individual trauma and societal failure. A child dropped on his head at birth, abandoned by his father, abused by his uncle, and failed by every system that should have protected him. But it's also a story about choice, about how some people, despite experiencing unimaginable trauma, choose healing and connection, while others choose destruction and isolation. The railroad killer terrorized America by exploiting the very infrastructure that connected our communities. The rail lines that were supposed to bring us together became the pathways for a predator who understood that mobility equals invisibility. In an increasingly connected world, he remained disconnected from human empathy, riding the rails like a ghost, leaving behind only death and shattered lives. Today, the train tracks where Holly Dunn and Christopher Meyer were attacked still carry freight across the American landscape, but they also carry the memory of what happened there, a reminder that evil can appear anywhere, anytime, wearing the face of someone who was once an innocent child, but became something far darker. The railroad killer's legacy is measured not just in the lives he took, but in the lives he shattered and the communities he terrorized. His story serves as a haunting reminder that monsters aren't born in horror movies. They're created in the shadowy margins of society, where neglected children become damaged adults, and damaged adults sometimes become predators who prey on the innocent. Angel Maturino Resendiz died as he had lived, alone, disconnected, and consumed by the very darkness he had helped create. But Holly Dunn's survival and subsequent advocacy remind us that even in the face of unimaginable evil, the human spirit can endure, heal, and ultimately triumph over the forces that seek to destroy it.